Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to our panel discussion tonight on Withering Ivy, how Donald Trump is cutting the roots of American academia. I think all of us are observing with horror and bewilderment what is going on in the United States since the new president has taken office. Attacks, as you all know, on human rights, on international law, on the NATO, on the global trade system, the judiciary, the media, independent institutions like the Federal Reserve, etc. Even attacks on the most unquestionable principles of the American Constitution. And last not least, as you all know, the president launched an unprecedented attack on the academic institutions. Latest news, as I just read last Wednesday, he signed an executive order that targets accrediting agencies. And the American Association of University Professors protested and stated, quote, "This would reshape higher education to fit an authoritarian political agenda." The professors are the enemy, as J.D. Vance put it quite blatantly. And it seems plausible that the president and his retinue regard universities as a hotbed, of course, of left-wing criticism and therefore fight their freedom of assembly and expression. But how can we explain that a president who claims to make his country great again cuts billions of funding for example, medical research, even if he demonstratively disdains all kinds of expert knowledge? One would assume that he might be aware of the possibility that even his own constituents might feel negative consequences of these attacks. So how can we make sense of all of that? Is it just due to anti-elite resentment, or is there a strategic plan behind all this, or both, or whatever? So, and the other question, of course, is where will all this lead? How vulnerable or how resistant are academic institutions in the US? As you know, since the initial shock when Columbia University immediately bowed to pressure, other American institutions have formed a broad front of defense, following Harvard's unequivocal response to the federal government's threat. Meanwhile, hundreds of leaders of America's colleges, of universities, scholarly societies, spoke against the unprecedented government overreach and political interference now endangering American higher education. It may turn out that cutting the Ivy's roots is not as easy as the president may have assumed. So what are the prospects? What will be the impact on academia worldwide? Should we Germans be alarmed as well that something similar could happen in Germany once the AfD comes to power, for example? How resilient is the German system of higher education, of funding, compared to the American one, etc.? These are some of the questions we would like to discuss tonight by three distinguished experts who will approach the topic from different perspectives, as experts from the US, from Canada, and from Germany. We are delighted to have you here, and I just briefly introduce them. On the right, Robert D. Newman, Professor Emeritus of English and longtime Director of the National Humanities Center in North Carolina, which is one of our partner institutes in the so-called SIAS circle. SIAS meaning some institutes of advanced study. Not any, but some, not any. We are particularly grateful that he traveled to the Grunewald, especially for this occasion. So, thank you very much. And I think it doesn't go without saying that he is here with us tonight because not every university leader in the US dares to talk openly about the topic at the moment. Next to him, Cheryl Misak, a fellow, current fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg, professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto, one of the leading experts of philosophical pragmatism. And she deals with questions like, what is truth? But we asked her to join this panel tonight, not so much because of this specific expertise, but rather because she also is an experienced academic administrator. She served among many other posts as vice president of the University of Toronto and can also contribute maybe the Canadian point of view to this, of the situation. And Ulrich Schreiterer, a sociologist and higher education expert, also a frequent guest, dear guest of the Wissenschaftskolleg, familiar with academia and academic culture on both sides of the Atlantic. He held various positions in German academic management, but also worked as a senior researcher at Yale University and the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin für Sozialforschung. He published extensively on science policy in Germany and the US, and authored a monograph, among others, titled Traumfabrik Harvard, warum amerikanische Hochschulen so anders sind. So Harvard Dream Factory, why American universities are so different. We are particularly grateful because he interrupted, if I'm well informed, his vacation just to join this panel tonight. And finally, we are delighted that Anna Ramic agreed to moderate the discussion. She is an expert of international relations. She worked for the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, and the transatlantic think tank Atlantikbrücke. And if I'm not mistaken, since 2022, she is vice president of the American Academy here in Berlin, our partner institute at the Wannsee. So I wish us all an illuminative evening, but not too depressing, I hope. And so I'm happy to pass on to Anna.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm American, so I'm just going to name everybody by their first names. I give myself that permission. Barbara, and to the Wissenschaftskolleg for inviting me and for inviting us. It's an honor, and the American Academy in Berlin is a very eager partner with your organization, with your fellows. I think we have 1 or 2 fellows and 1 or 2 staff of the Academy here as well. So we're all very, very happy to be here. And thank you for all of you to join us. As you mentioned, I work at the American Academy in Berlin at the Wannsee, and we bring about a dozen, 12 to 13 fellows every academic semester to live at the Academy at the Wannsee and work with us, much like fellows live and work here as well. By our nature and our mission, we are committed to open dialogue, intellectual exploration, free inquiry, transatlantic exchange. And so when academic freedom and free speech in the US is threatened, it really strikes at the core of what we do. So this topic is really incredibly urgent to us, to all of you. As Barbara mentioned, the universities in the US are facing political pressure, unlike anything we've seen in decades. The Trump administration is using about $60 billion a year, I think, in federal research funding to reshape higher education overall according to its political goals, and they have very sort of clear reasons for why they're doing this. This all started with concerns about anti-Semitism after October 2023, when the campus protests began, most notably at Columbia, but it has grown into a more broad campaign against academic independence. Thus far, the White House has created a task force to investigate universities, cut billions in funding to Harvard and Columbia and others, and threatened to remove nonprofit status from certain institutions. The goal, which I just mentioned, is to make higher education great again, unsurprisingly. But, and we can debate that here, and we'll get into it hopefully in a minute, is that the real effect is growing pressure on what scholars can research, what they can teach, what they can say. We are seeing some pushback, as all of you are aware of in the media. There's open letters, and things are going to court, et cetera. But the bigger question is, how long can universities resist? What are the avenues that are open to them when it's the federal government itself that's applying pressure? And academic freedom is not just an American issue, of course. When it's weakened in the U.S., it impacts global research networks, innovation, and democracy itself. And so I'm really glad that we have multiple viewpoints from Canada and from Germany as Barbara's mentioned. So tonight we'll explore what's actually happening here. Is there a deliberate strategy at play? How resilient universities are? What is the pushback that we've seen already? What commonalities are there between Germany and the US? Obviously, we're sitting here in Berlin and in Germany, and what lessons could or should be taken away. So I'm honored to be joined here by the three of you experts. My role will be to speak as little as possible after this. I'll just throw out some questions and maybe cut you off if you're going on too long and moving on to the next thing. I will ask each of you sort of a specific question to get us going. We'll feel free to have this conversation on stage, and at some point we'll also open it up to the audience for Q&A. So with that said, Professor Newman, I'd like to start with you, and I'd like to ask you to sort of zoom out completely, go wide lens, and give us a brief overview of the history of the American Research University, why this moment is distinctive, and what are the principles of academic freedom in America or in American universities in general.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Barbara, for inviting me and bringing me here, and thanks to the staff and fellows at VICO for their hospitality as well. First, a disclaimer, I have no expertise in this subject. I am not a legal scholar. I am not a scholar of the history of higher education, but I'm doing, obviously, a lot of reading on this topic. I've been very much informed by writers like David Cole and Heather Cox Richardson and a number of others reading about academic freedom and the threats that we're currently facing. I am by training a narrative theorist, and I've done a lot of work on the works of James Joyce, and actually reading the news these past 100 days has been very much like trying to decipher Finnegan's Wake, although not nearly as pleasurable. So let me start by quoting the executive order that came out in early March from the Trump administration. And then I'll do a very brief overview of the American Research University and the major principles of academic freedom as defined by the American Association of University Professors, and then we'll go from there. So let me quote the executive order. All federal funding will stop in capital letters, for any college, school, or university that allows illegal protests. And illegal protest is never defined. Agitators will be imprisoned or permanently sent back to the country from which they came. American students will be permanently expelled or, depending on the crime, arrested. And then capitals again, no masks. That's the executive order. No masks. Masks, M-A-S-K-S. Masks.
And this was probably on Truth Social or somewhere.
So for much of its history, the American University really has stood at the intersection between knowledge production and the national interest. The emphasis on universities and on the public good has been at the forefront of what a university has been about. We are, in the United States, after all, a republic. And the idea in the Constitution of a republic is premised completely on the idea of the public good. And the universities have been seen as part of the public good. In 1862, we had the Morrill Act, and that established land-grant universities throughout the United States. And it was one of the first federal efforts to expand access to higher education to most people, and also trying to align colleges with the needs of a growing industrial economy. In 1890, we had the second Morrill Act, and that brought funding to historically black colleges and universities, of which by my last count, there are about 104 in the United States now. And it also reinforced the idea, again, that higher education was a public good. One that served not only individuals, but also the broader needs of the nation. And then during World War II and the Cold War, universities were fundamentally transformed into engines of state power. And at that point, research became bound to military and technological supremacy. The war effort, World War II, really demonstrated the strategic value of academic research to the general public because universities played such a crucial role in so many projects, like the Manhattan Project, the development of radar, showing that scientific breakthroughs created by university research could determine military superiority. In 1945, Vannevar Bush, who was a key wartime science administrator, argued that the federal government should sustain this kind of partnership with the universities in peacetime as well. And this led to the creation of the National Science Foundation in 1950. And from then on, higher education was thought to be integral to American dominance on the global stage. By the time we get to the 1960s, in the wake of Russia's launch of the Sputnik satellite, America was really seized by a national fervor in the wake of this launch for more scientific and technological education. Federal research and development funding just absolutely ballooned, it skyrocketed. And it supported not just engineering and military projects, but the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts as well. And universities became really the hubs of government-backed knowledge production throughout the country. Huge investments were made. Those investments fueled things like medical research, space exploration, global diplomacy, and literary magazines, for that matter. Knowledge was seen at this point in time not to be partisan in any way. It was a good in itself, knowledge production. It was seen as a national asset. So what's really distinctive about what is happening now from the history of the American Research University? And as you know, of course, the American Research University is very much premised on the model of the 19th century German Research University. What's really happened now is that the very concept of the research university in America as an autonomous institution that is dedicated to the national interest and is seen as a national asset is under direct attack. That's not happened before. Academic freedom rests on a kind of social bargain that professors in universities are granted security and independence. And they're granted that in exchange for nurturing expertise and knowledge that will pay dividends to society at large. That social bargain is being broken, and that's completely new. So the American Association of University Professors was founded in 1915. It was founded, its first president was John Dewey, the leader in the thought of pragmatism, and also Arthur Lovejoy, who pretty much started the idea of the history of ideas, wrote The Great Chain of Being. And it was started to protect academic freedom and shared governance in universities, which is a very strong principle. The AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, basically is based on three fundamental principles of academic freedom, and I'll just very briefly summarize them. First, that teachers and researchers are entitled to full freedom in research and in publication of the results. Second, that teachers should have the same freedom in the classroom. And third, that college and university professors are citizens and therefore should be free to speak and write as citizens, free from any kind of institutional censorship by the universities themselves. And these principles, it's important to note, do not discourage controversy at all. Controversy is seen sometimes as the kind of lifeblood of a university. It's the culture of debate, which is so fundamental to the humanities, certainly, which is my background. But they must be done in an atmosphere of professionalism and based on academic expertise. So professors are not necessarily to introduce into their teaching or to their research controversial matter which has no relationship to their subjects, to their academic expertise. This is the kind of distinction between just free speech and academic freedom. So let me just stop there to give you, hopefully that's a decent summary for the background.
Let me ask you just one follow-up question before moving on. When it comes to the universities that are on the radar of the administration, is there a difference between private universities and public universities, or are they all sort of bundled in there?
So the focus primarily has been on the elite, what are considered quote-unquote elite universities, the Ivy Leagues in particular, but also the elite public universities like University of California at Berkeley is certainly considered one. University of Michigan is considered another. So this is, and public universities in democratic states. That's where the focus has been.
But there has been a very general attack on university budgets. So just to follow up one thread here on freedom of speech and inquiry, I think what we're seeing now is very unlike the usual free speech battles. So when I was provost at the University of Toronto, really every other week, someone would pull a fire alarm to stop someone from saying what they were saying. And actually the bad behavior was very equally distributed between the so-called right and the so-called left. So the Jewish Defense League would come and try to disrupt Israel Apartheid Week, which originated at the University of Toronto. And our left-wing students would pull fire alarms to stop the speech of men's rights group. We also had Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto. So but this is just ordinary, not very pleasant, but democratic activity. People battling it out over what speech is acceptable and what speech is not acceptable. Right now in the United States, we have something very, very different. We have an authoritarian government really attacking freedom of speech across universities, freedom of inquiry across universities, and this is just, it's unlike the usual free speech battles. And there is also something general in the attacks on universities. So it's not just the sort of follow-up attack on Columbia and Harvard. We're going to cancel all federal research contracts, which is absolutely devastating if it happens to research in the United States of America. And to universities. But the first move that the Trump administration made was to reduce the indirect costs or the overhead on all research. These overhead costs were, and still are, negotiated university by university. So for instance, foundations, like the Diabetes Foundation, they will give very little in terms of indirect costs. Indirect cost pays for the lighting, it pays for the mouse facility, but it also pays for a lot of other things in universities. The humanities, the social sciences. You can tell the finances of an American university more or less based on, do they have a great medical research school and a great engineering school? They're going to be rich if they do, because often the indirect costs of research are 60 cents on the dollar. It's a lot of money coming into university budgets, and at 60 cents if you're at Harvard, maybe it's 49 cents if you're at at the University of Montana. But still, the University of Montana will be getting that additional money in their budgets. And by slashing indirect costs from, say, 60 cents on the dollar to a maximum of 15 cents on the dollar was just right off the bat a really vicious and quite clever attack on all universities' budgets. So if the university in question is a small liberal arts college in New Hampshire, perhaps they don't have research, perhaps they won't be hit by this first move. But any university, public or private, that has research has had their budgets savaged by that first move.
So what does that mean? What is the impact on these universities? And then what levers are available to them to push back, I suppose?
Well, so just on indirect costs, the impact is financially huge. So what we saw immediately were universities saying to their departments, okay, you've sent out all these offers to graduate students, but you must cancel them or suspend them. Because graduate students in North America are money out the door. We pay for not only their tuition, but their living expenses. So right away, graduate student recruitment and admissions were frozen. Thousands and thousands of people lost their jobs in universities. Johns Hopkins right away, I think they let 2,000 people go because they had
And this
to.
in the last sort of month and a half alone.
This was immediate, yes, on the news that indirect costs of research were going to be capped at 15%. And then we have the follow-up attacks on Columbia and Harvard, and also some public universities are on that hit list. And then on top of that, we have the news that perhaps nonprofit status will be yanked from university. Every week there's some other terrible purported attack on universities. So this is, as I say, it's not just, every institution, I'm sure this institution deals with freedom of expression and speech issues, but this is a systematic attack on freedom of expression and on universities in the United States.
So how distinct is this? Has this happened before? Has there been an administration in the last, say, 50 years in the US that has tried to use some of these levers available to them to...
Yes, we had the Red Scare in the 1950s, of course, during the Cold War. So this is very reminiscent of what was taking place during the Red Scare in the 1950s. Again, the attack on universities, of course, it was done under the guise of, this is being done under the guise of theoretical anti-Semitism and other things. But there it was the anti-communist stance that was going on. And there were attacks on universities and suppression of free speech, lots of firings and so forth and so on. So this seems to be somewhat of an echo of what was going on in American universities at that point. This one seems to be a little bit better organized at this point as well. And its attack on the finances as a means to limit the power of universities is very, very strategic.
So a lot of this is going to court, soon. It's really hard to say what will happen. But in terms of the pushback by some of these universities, Harvard obviously, very famously is not going to comply. Columbia is trying to make a deal. What avenues are available to these American universities? What happens if they lose this federal funding? What can they do? Or Ulrich, did you want to ask?
Well,
I
go ahead.
just want to make a different point.
Yeah.
I think it would fall short just to focus on academic freedom and on self-regulation. What we are seeing right here is less about academy or research, it's about an institution. It's about a warfare, a cultural warfare to diminish, humiliate, reduce the impact and the position of institutions that have become icons of American sort of liberalism and performance. It's attack not on freedom of speech and research, but on the institutions. And it's not for nothing that the first route goes on the well-known, well-funded, proud, independent American universities. In a comparative perspective, I kind of always envied the American private universities in that the very, as it were, features of their funding coming from different funding streams guaranteed them a degree of independence and resilience that was completely unseen and unheard of in all state-funded systems in Europe and elsewhere. So this has been under attack now, and it's not about specific fields of research, and it's not about anti-Semitism, it's just a pretext. It's about the, as it were, standing of these institutions that are considered to be representing and reproducing the elites. And now what's happening is they have been, scorned and laughed at and called idiots by Mr. Maga. And so it's a cultural warfare, and which is, doesn't make it better because it's even more difficult to assess and to fight against. When it comes to the fallouts in research and for the budgets, that could be managed to some extent. But what does it do to these, to the future and the sort of outlooks of these institutions when this well-orchestrated warfare goes on? And
let me respond to your question and also comment on your point as well. So for those that are not enmeshed in university administrations, it might be helpful to talk a little bit about how the funding works. So essentially, and I was a dean previous to my position in the National Humanities Center, so I have some familiarity with this. So essentially, what we have is tuition revenue as one stream. We have research overhead money as another stream. And then essentially, what comes in other than sports money and money generated from football revenue and television and so forth and so on, depending on what university that you're at. Then we also have donations, and those donations go to making up endowments primarily. Now, for a very rich university like Harvard, which has a $53 billion endowment, one can easily say, oh, well, you can just make it up out of your endowment. Well, most endowments are roughly 80% restricted funding, as you were saying. So if people give money, so a building is named for them, and that money has to go to the building, or it's for a particular scholarship or a particular program. So you just can't mix and match with that money. So if the research overhead money is limited, and much of the research overhead money is going to pay for postdocs, particularly foreign students coming to universities, paying for graduate students, as Cheryl was saying. So if you can't do the research any longer, you can't keep the lights on, you can't hire graduate students, you can't hire research assistants, you have to cut staff positions, you have to cut faculty positions. When a faculty member retires, you can't necessarily replace that faculty member any longer. So your alternative is to raise more money from donors, but then what's being threatened is the 501c3 tax-exempt status if one doesn't perform in accordance with what is now being demanded. And if you don't have that, you don't have donors writing checks because it's not tax exempt. They can't get a tax break on the checks that they're writing any longer. So that money
And you have to pay taxes on the money.
Exactly, right. You have to pay taxes on the money, so you can't give as much if you want to give at all. So that's a problem. So the only avenue really open to you at that point is to raise tuition. Mm-hmm. So which becomes an incredible burden on the students that this administration is attempting to say that they're trying to save.
This sounds a bit like the tariffs issue.
Exactly.
In the end, it's the prices that are raised, right?
Yeah, it's very problematic. So the other thing I guess I want to say is that in response to Uli's comment, when we have political leaders that want to move to more authoritarian forms of government, what they often do is try to undermine independent sources of information and accountability. And diminishing higher education is a very important part of that strategy. Because what do we do in universities? We essentially are pursuing truth, empirical truth. And if we're pursuing empirical truth, that's a threat to those authorities and to undermining sources of credible information and accountability. Putin has a very famous statement He said that wars are won by teachers. Putin said this. And of course, he proceeded to close a number of universities in Russia. And his Turkish counterpart did the same thing. And in India, we see dissident scholars being arrested. And we have Orban essentially having universities report to foundations that are loyal to him at this point. So it's a major change to an authoritarian movement that we're seeing take place. And it's very, very strategic, and it's very, very well mapped out. If you read the Project 2025 document that was put out by the Heritage Foundation during Trump's campaign, it's pretty much laid out in that. And there's historical background, which I'm happy to get into, behind that as well.
So this is really basically part of a comprehensive strategy that might include, fighting with the law firms, that might include tariffs, and isn't, as President Trump is sometimes accused of being very mercurial, and he's angry at somebody, or the last thing he sees on TV influences the next thing he does the thing he does the next morning. But you all, the three of you, as you're nodding along, seem to agree that this is really part of a broader strategy of this administration.
Yes, but let's stick to, so yes, it's part of a broad strategy. It's a culture war. It's what is in the Heritage Project. But let's just take a step back and just enumerate what is being demanded of universities by the Trump administration, because I think we've just missed that. So there's been this big budget cut because of indirect costs. Then there are these very specific threats to Columbia, to Harvard, and there's a long list of universities that are going to be threatened next. So Columbia, the threat is to pull $400 million government contracts, government funding away, and Harvard is $2.2 billion. So it's a lot of money. What are these universities supposed to do in order to not have this very substantial sum of money pulled away from them? Well, some of the things one might think they're terrible, but universities could do them without actually ceasing to fulfill their core mission. So some of the things that have been demanded, no masks on campus. Okay, well, a university could put a rule in place that unless you had a medical reason, you can't wear a mask on campus. That's a demand that doesn't attack the university's core mission. But at both Columbia and Harvard, there were demands that Columbia put one of their departments, a department that is seen as problematic in terms of the Trump administration, into receivership, i.e. they can't govern themselves, they have to be governed in a way that's approved by the Trump administration. Harvard, the demands are frankly insane. Like they almost forced Harvard to resist, because there's a long list of departments, including the Faculty of Medicine and the Kennedy School and education. It just goes on and on. All of these faculties and departments have to be reformed. This is a real attack on academic freedom, right? These reforms are going to be, some alt-right reforms. So universities can't say, oh, okay, we'll do that, the way they might say, okay, we'll put in a policy where you can't wear a mask on campus. If Harvard were to reform all of these departments and faculties, they would be a university in name only. That their very core values of academic freedom and inquiry will have been given up.
And this is the criticism of Columbia, I guess, in some respect, right? That they did effectively say yes, and now we don't. I suppose we're still waiting to see what happens.
But this was a very sorry, sad incident. So first Columbia caves. They say, yes, we'll do everything you demand. And then their new president tells a group of 70 faculty members on Zoom, oh, don't worry. I'm sure these faculty members are giving her a hard time. She says, oh, don't worry. We don't have any intention of doing any of these things. So of course, her job
This is the interim president,
Yes.
which I think is the vice chair of the board.
No, this is Tina Armstrong, who
Right,
then
okay.
had to resign.
Okay,
Because,
Not the national.
right, so we don't really have a good sense of what universities are intending to do. They probably don't have a very good sense of that themselves. They're flailing, but Harvard has made this very good stand. The letter was excellent. It spoke about its core values, and they're doing, I think, the only thing they can do, which is going to court on the basis of the process that is put in place as a matter of law. If you're going to fire a faculty member or close the department, you have to. There's a process, and the Trump administration's slogan here has been, what is it? Shut it down first, and
Shoot first, ask questions later.
Shoot first, ask questions later. But it's something more specific.
Sounds like move
Yeah.
fast and break things,
Yes,
I think
yes,
is the old
yeah,
tech.
yeah.
Ulrich, you wanted to say?
Well, I'm feeling a bit uneasy because I'm trying to sort of demoderate a little in that these instances you mentioned, like Harvard should close not a department, but some programs within a department that mostly had to do with humanitarian aid and humanitarian whatever it is, to me is just the fringe, as it were. It's very visible, but it's not at the very center. The very center of these initiatives, of this, what I call orchestrated attacks, is to enforce compliance of the universities, to enforce regulatory schemes that clearly show they are not the masters of the universe and less so masters of their own businesses anymore. If you read this letter that was sent to Harvard on April 11 by the two departments of the DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Education, plus the GSA, the General Service Administration, it clearly it's become so clear. It's not about individual programs, etc., but reviewing merit-based hirings reform. And the government is demanding that by August 5, all hiring, reviewing, etc., evaluation report of the last, 20 years should be sent to the government and come under a review from an independent panel. Same merit-based admission reform, which is a sort of euphemism. It's they're trying to oppose all these kind of affirmative action and quota systems, DEI policies. So again, they demand to have all the data of the applicants be provided for to the whatever authority and reviewed through an independent panel up to the end of 2028. Independent panel. And they're going, it goes on and on like that. At international admissions reform, to safeguard that no student or no applicant who comes close to be, challenging American values would be admitted or even heard or even considered, etc., etc. Viewpoint of diversity in admissions and hiring, safeguard that in the faculty and in the student body there should be a variety of divergent views, etc., etc., etc. So this is pretty tough, and the instrument, the tool to force the universities to get there, it's not just about cutting the overhead costs. It's mainly about the threat to rescind their tax status, make them in the endowments taxable. Now in 2017, Trump had already introduced something like that. They are now being charged at 1.7%, if I'm correct on that. Yeah. And they are now thinking about taxing their endowments with 31% corporate taxes. Wow, that would be a hefty blow, wouldn't it? And so it goes on like that, cutting programs that are direct funds, not the NSF funds, to universities. mostly in the medical branch,
But
Department of Health.
but that's just because that's where the federal money is going, right?
Sure,
So, yeah,
sure.
yeah.
But
So,
there are some spikes which are, from the point of view of academic freedom, very, very irritating. The president of the NSF has stepped back yesterday. And it is also because the National Science Foundation, sorry. And it's because, what is it, a number? 400 sort of ongoing grants have been cut and kept in under no reasons whatsoever. So just to demonstrate we are the masters of the game. And unless you comply to these and these and these conditions, you wouldn't get any money any further, et cetera, et cetera. If this is legal, I have no clue, probably not.
Does it matter?
Does it matter? To the institutions, very much so, yes.
yeah, so I don't want to at all challenge your assertion this is terrible and vile. But in fact, reasons are being given for why certain grants are being cut, say in the National Science Foundation. So there are 3 levels of savage cuts. First, indirect costs across the board. Second, Columbia, I'm going to get you. Harvard, I'm going to get you. And third is, through some artificial intelligence program, they're going in and they're picking up words in research grant proposals and things that have been funded already, and they're canceling them because they have the words that the Trump administration doesn't like. Equity. So if you work on women's reproductive health, you're likely to get your grant canceled. If you work on sexually transmitted diseases, you're likely to get your grant canceled. If you work on anything that has equity in it, and then of course there was this absurdity because it's AI that's picking up these bad words. Transgenic mice. Someone what was working on transgenic mice had the word trans in it, and this was picked up as a research grant or proposal that would be canceled or not funded. So they are going after projects that they don't like, as well as making across-the-board attacks and cuts.
They even went after Enola Gay.
Yep.
After what?
The strategic bomber that threw the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima was called Enola Gay.
Because of the word gay, right? Yeah. Okay. So if the end goal is subjugation, and we talked a little bit about this before the start, there's all these open letters, and we alluded to them, and the Trump administration must be sitting back and laughing and how pathetic these, open letters are, and what are they going to do? How should we all be responding to this? How should we be thinking about this? Should we be speaking out about this? What does the resistance look like at these universities? Okay, they go to court, and then let's see what happens. And then I'd like to move on to the German aspect. But what should we be doing in the U.S. short of going to the streets? What is the recourse?
So we were talking earlier about how we were going to organize ourselves, and I said that if things continue like this, I don't see any alternative but for Americans to go to the streets in a really, really serious way. As far as what universities can do, they are now doing what they can do, I think. They're taking the administration to court on mostly due process grounds. And they've had to raise money to do this. Some of them have taken out huge loans. Some of them have floated bonds. They have to fund their operations and the court cases. We should all be speaking out about it, but that has whatever small effect it can have. We should be speaking out about it, but it's a very serious situation. So I don't think there's an easy fix here.
Robert, just a quick.
I don't think there's an easy fix either. However, I have to say, and obviously this is going to be dealt with through the courts, And we worry about the judiciary in America at this point, and what power it still has, and the Supreme Court is largely conservative at this point as well. So I'll have to say, but it's also a moment, I think, for a wake-up call for universities throughout the world. And I know I can only speak about American universities, and I think in the past few decades, we haven't in American universities done a sufficient job in explaining our purpose and the good that we do and the benefits that we have in terms of the national interest to a larger public. We often speak as scholars to ourselves only, to other scholars. And when we do public-facing research or work within the community, often it's with an attitude that we are bringing knowledge to the community rather than working in collaboration and cooperation with the community where knowledge is flowing both ways. I think, teachers exist in all guises. And classrooms are not only within four walls. And research is now, particularly with technology, multifaceted. And the potential for doing things that are more involving with the public at large and for communicating with the public at large are all there. And I think, for all the accusations that universities, American universities, are the bastions of neo-Marxism, they are some of the most conservative entities that have ever existed. They don't like to change very often at all. And so we have things like promotion and tenure requirements that are antiquated, and people that are doing public service projects that are good, solid public research or community involvement with pedagogical projects, getting students to work in the community as part of their pedagogical experience, particularly in an era of climate change. Why don't we have more students working on projects that are not just dealing with their own identities, but also thinking about the legacy beyond those identities and how their lives affect other lives and the planet at large, and doing actual projects that would, I think, speak volumes to the general community in terms of positive things. So I think this is a moment where a kind of inner revolution has to take place as well in terms of how we do our business in universities that is much more flexible, much more open, much more collaborative, and involves the general public much more, so we are more persuasive. And we're not seen as intellectual ivory towers that are out of touch. And I think that has to be factored in as we reward people in universities. What have they done in terms of these kinds of things? Not to take away from the good things that they're doing in their research and teaching, but as additive.
Can any of these things happen if the cost of higher education in America stays where it is or rises?
It's problematic at this point, but one can think a bit about different entities and different formulas. I mean, I think first of all, you have certain universities that I think of, Arizona State University, for example, which is now the largest university in the United States. It has a student body of over 100,000. And part of the mission that has been not always accepted by researchers at other universities has been to really reach out to the public. And by doing that, the Republican legislature came on board and shifted more of their funding to Arizona State than to the University of Arizona. They have almost an open admissions process. Almost everybody who applies gets in. And a lot of the pedagogical projects are involved in the community. How this is translated over the years is that their alumni giving rate is around 80%. That's phenomenal. So the money comes back in eventually if you do the right thing. And I don't think we should change who we are as universities, but I think we can think a little bit differently and more expansive forms of how we do things, and more flexible forms and more collaborative forms. So I think that this is really a wake-up call, and we need to win the battle.
Arizona State University is where Shaquille O'Neal got his master's degree, so maybe a lot of the giving back is
It could very
from
well
his
be.
pocket.
But again, 80% is a large
Yeah,
figure.
absolutely. Did you want to?
Yeah, sorry to be that intrusive, but the snag is, do we have enough time to get these changes done? And as for me, I personally would think that the odds are short that the electorate, MAGA electorate, plus the deplorable fringes, would be heavily invested in supporting the further standing and nourishing of private research institutions. So how would you be able to sort of get this public support? Not by open letters, not by manifestations. I don't know why, how, but it's truly an uphill battle, and time is running out.
This is something that the Democratic Party in general is grappling. You see Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, going out there on the road, resisting, fighting. But I suppose here, as in the U.S., the right has always had a more successful communication strategy, I suppose, than the Democratic Party has, and therefore also these institutions. So the communication point is a very, very important one. How do you get that across? But I would love to ask you, Ulrich, now to move on to a little bit about how the situation that we've just spent, almost an hour talking about in the U.S. compares to the situation here in Germany, to German universities. Is there a similar risk that we see here? Are there safeguards in place in German educational system that would prevent a similar occurrence? And then maybe taking Cheryl, after that, a bit of a global overview. What do you see as similarities in your country as well, since you are not American? Well, Americans sometimes forget that about Canadians, as you can see on display, but you...
Well, to start with your latter observation, you never can be sure. It can't happen here. This famous, infamous novel by Upton Sinclair, it happens. And sure, there's apples and oranges if you look at the German and the American higher education systems in terms of funding, in terms of institutions, in terms of diversity, in size, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the main differences is that the German academy, the German science, as it were, enterprise, has a safeguard or a reeling in the constitution. It's very kind of unique, if I'm not completely mistaken. It's not the academic freedom in Germany doesn't result from freedom of speech, individual right, but it's guaranteed as a constitutional right, a basic law stipulation. And this encompasses two things. One, it's the freedom of individual researchers, all people that are, as it were, due to their profession or professional roles, doing teaching and researching in an institution that's committed to that, to defend all infringements and calls to any direction to their work. And it also encompasses a kind of institutional guarantee, not just a guarantee for these places that are, as it were, shown to do research and academic teaching, let them alone, but from the side of the state, the government, to fund them. Mm-hmm. Does it also stipulate that the funding has to be at a given height or a given level? No, but in principle, it's guaranteed, it's as it were, acknowledged that the state has to support, due to the reasons you were lining out on the role of the academy in the US as well, research and teaching at universities. So this is the main difference, and there could be, anybody could go to the German Constitutional Court and fight any kind of infringements of state governments or individuals or corporations to do this and that. So there's a difference, and when it comes to the reactions or how people in Germany look on what's going on in the US, of course there's a lot of bewilderment and people feel uneasy and even scared what's going on there. But there's also some kind of not very explicit Schadenfreude in that this role model America is now not the number one, completely beyond reach and doubt, and that they're having their own troubles.
The wings are melting.
The wings are melting, and maybe we could have windfall profits in, recruiting some top researchers at conditions that 2 years ago nobody would have thought of possible.
This was a question about federal workers. Is there, can Germany sort of draw some of these people who are now out of work in the United States, whether they worked at USAID or other institutions? Do you expect that professors, academics, researchers will look for ways to come to Germany, to Europe? Do you expect students will want to enroll in universities? American students will want to leave the US and enroll elsewhere?
There may be one or two, but don't expect miracles, don't expect waves, and we have enough problems with our own people and the academy to keep them in a position and fund them, and have a career path which is sort of reliable so.
Okay. Okay.
It's very
I'm
ambivalent.
glad this is recorded for everybody that thought about applying for jobs. Not yet.
No, wait a minute. There's some people have like wet dreams of getting the top notches, future Nobel Prize winners. And of course, Max Planck is one of the institutions that considers itself to be at the front of the German research system that tries to buy people right now or attract people, targeted recruitments now. If this would be successful, I don't know, because simply do the math. What do you earn even as a Max Planck director in Germany? What would you earn as a sort of full professor at any of the Ivy Leagues?
Right.
It's even if cost of living might be higher.
I know we have some people from the American American university campuses here in Berlin, so hopefully we'll get some questions from you guys as well. But Canada has an election today. Yeah. One of the people is more conservative than the other. What happened?
So first off, it did happen here, right? So where did all of those great American physicists, mathematicians, logicians, philosophers come from? They came from Germany and Austria and other European countries when these countries lost their brains to mostly America. It did happen here, and it can happen here again. You've got the AfD. We've got this little mini Trump that hopefully will not be elected tonight. He's just as anti-woke university as the big Trump. It can happen in Canada. It has happened here. It can happen again. Even if by some stroke of great luck and will, things turn around fairly quickly in the United States. The United States universities and brain trust is really damaged after the last few months. I mean, it's damaged almost in the way things were damaged here, and I don't think it's I don't think it's controversial to say that Germany and Austria are just recovering, right? If you lose a generation of the best people in the world from your universities, it's not easy to bounce back. So it can, as you say, there's an election in Canada right now. Even though it looks like our mini Trump won't be elected, every Canadian should be shaken like a leaf right now because we see what's happening south of the border. And everyone should be pretty freaked out for their own countries, given what we've seen happen in Poland and Hungary.
Turkey.
Yep.
Question on that front, everybody should be worried. Are there universities in the US which are not worried at all? Are there any that are just, I mean, Arizona State, I don't know, but are there
Well, no,
any that are safe
well,
because?
there are some religious universities that there are certain universities that have a very, how should I say, conservative slant that I think are pretty much in favor. So, yes, there are probably exceptions that are not under these kinds of, or at least they're not targets at this point in time. But again, I don't think it's necessarily, they're targeting individual universities, but as Uli was saying, I think quite eloquently, I think, we're talking about something larger than specific targets. This is just an attempt to fundamentally disempower universities as being seen as I was saying in my opening remarks, as a national asset, and to demonize them. And it's part of a larger plan, basically, to undermine credible information and accountability. I think it's very much in league with those things.
It's very clear that there's an appetite here to discuss this topic further and, in the future, perhaps with other, as you mentioned in one of your questions, with other actors, with other voices from other points of view. And I'm sure we could spend many, many days still talking about this without a resolution. It's a very complex topic, but I'm really glad that the Wissenschaftskolleg has made this possible this evening for us, in this case, to talk about this, that the three of you have gotten together, that you're here for a while, but that you've come out here for this conversation, and that you've apparently broken your vacation for this. So very, very much appreciate it, the three of you, your insights. It was very inspiring. And very much appreciate the Wissenschaftskolleg and Barbara for hosting this evening, and to all of you for coming out, and hopefully we will continue this dialogue in the future. So thank you very much. Have a nice evening.